Hello everyone, today we talk about the Aedui, or the Aedui if you prefer. I will stick to the first pronunciation to be more thought-provoking throughout the video. Besides, you can spell their name differently depending on what literary tradition you're following. They can be A-E-D-U-I or H, A-E-D-U-I. In any case, the Aedui were a Gallic tribe dwelling in the essentially modern Burgundy region that we've seen also in the medieval playlist. Very often, probably the Dutch, the core historical land would, of course, take that name and shape in just essentially from late antiquity and the Middle Ages. During the Iron Age and the Roman period, the Aedui had, as we will see today, an ambiguous relationship with the Romans and with other Gallic tribes. For matters of convenience, as they were fundamentally among the most powerful Gauls, right, and what properly we call such, because as you know, Gaul was populated also by the Belgae. The Romans distinguished, right, among these peoples, and the Gauls altogether did too, and more of that later. In 121 BC, the Aedui appealed to Rome against the Arverni and the Allobroges, as we will see, so that this started an alliance with Rome. The Aedui were the most easily cooptable Gauls by Rome, given their greater development. Right, when we're looking at these central Gallic peoples, we're looking not just, in fact, at the most developed in the region, but also in the whole Celtic world, right? As we will see, their political institutional profile was more advanced. Also, their oppida were particularly developed in a proto-urban direction, and both the Romans and the Aedui saw some important points of connections that will be expressed at different levels, politically, culturally, and more of this later. During the Gallic Wars, between 58 and 50 BC, the Aedui provided with valuable, though not well-hearted support to Caesar, before eventually giving lukewarm support to Vercingetorix in 52 BC. And although they were involved in the revolt of Julius Sacrovir in 21 AD and the one of Vindex even in 68, the Aeduan aristocracy became one of the most successfully Romanized in the empire, given their previous level of development, in fact. The Aedui are mentioned as Ardues by Polybius in the 2nd century BC, as Aedui with the H at the beginning of the word by Cicero in the mid-1st century BC, and Caesar in the same time as Haedus with the H by Livy in the late 1st century BC, Aedui without H by Pliny, and that's the name that stuck fundamentally also graphically in the mid-1st century AD. But we have, for example, the Aeduan in Hellenic by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, Aedui by Cassius Dio even in the 3rd. And the ethnonym Aedui is essentially the Latinized form of the Gallic Aedui, singular Aeduos, which means the ardent ones, referring essentially to the sacred fire in the Indo-European tradition that, as we will see, in fact, has a lot in common with many other names from the rest of the Celtic world, even with Latin and beyond. In fact, the term derives from the Celtic Aedu, which is probably fire, ardor, which, as you understand, is spiritually meant. The Old Irish Aed means fire. The Welsh Aed means ardor. So, of course, this was referred to the broader furor, as the Romans would have called actually their own virtus. We just made a couple of videos about the Indo-European sacred fury and what it meant comparatively by by degrees. You can compare also the Irish deity Aed or Aud, right? And the root word comes from the Proto-Indo-European Eidos, which can be translated as firewood, right? If you look at Sanskrit, you find Edus, that is the bonfire, the Latin Ides, that is literally a building, specifically a temple, right? So much that Aedui could have had that semantic shade as well, also considering the important constructions of the Aedui in their own territory, infrastructurally, and so on. So not just the ardent ones, but those also that were devoted to build as temples where fire was preserved. Just like think about Rome with the Vestal Virgins, or the sacred fire of the Veda, made a video on just a couple of months ago. And there is connection with ancient Hellenic as well. For example, Aether, so the god of the upper sky, the idea of in fact of heaven, or Aethra, that is the bright sky, the kingdom of the lights, and in fact Aetho, that is to ignite, to kindle, right? That all they back to that common root. It would be interesting to follow this video by reading the actual Roman sources, but we will leave this for another more theoretical themed one. Right, today we make a bit the broader history of the Aedui as a Gallic people, but the details, the approximations, the semantics of the sources are crucial to understand better this people's identity, culture, mentality. As it's known, the Aedui, as other tribes of Gaul, boasted, for example, a Germanic descent. And this was caused by different reasons. First of all, what we call the Celts essentially did migrate from Central Europe, from an area that in the times in which the Romans could document such statements, evidently from the same Gallic peoples that they began to live amongst, were definitely aware of their ancestral migrations. As you know, the area of Central Europe is the one from which the same Italics had migrated from, and the Celts understood that that ancestral base that we are essentially looking at, even Proto-Indo-European times, is to say, at least in times in which there weren't really the same branches neatly distinguished as the later one, because again, we're practically all the same, also together with the Germans. They appreciated the fact that their origin stemmed from such core that they still perceived as the righteous one, and we will see which cultural changes they had undergone throughout the centuries as well. But it was important to stress at different levels. This is just a geographical kind of ethnogenesis myth, right? And it's correct also as far as we can consider it historically, aside from the fact that, again, there wasn't quite a thing just like the Celts or the Germans. But the concept is just like the one of nobility. You understand even the name of these peoples. We will understand their meanings better also later. But the idea of a more primitive warlike past, right, unspoiled by the riches of Gaul, for example, and distinguished, characterized by this kind of greater contact with the sacred, etc., is a leitmotif of the entire Indo-European mythology and historiography and literature. This is what the same Romans wrote when they looked, for example, at some costumes of the Gauls and especially of the Germans, recognizing kind of that unspoiled primitiveness, but together also with like a minor accomplishment overall in what had become like now a fully rational, hierarchical and almost geometric age of order, as we have illustrated the virtues being like, and in theory also for these same peoples in a recent video. The Aedui would also incorporate the legendary past of Rome in their own mythological origin, because during the Empire they thought, for example, that like the Romans, they were descended from Trojans, and this sense of kingship underwrote their long alliance with Rome from an early age, for which we can't even necessarily think that this was a product of Romanization, but that on the contrary, as we've seen also for other peoples, it was somehow normal to claim, to boast, right? Which were the greatest heroes of the entire world at the time. I mean, the Iliad was really known also abroad. The mythical past of those heroes was a universal patrimonium, and everybody was obsessed, as much as the Romans were with Alexander, with etc. And of course, a lot of knowledge that we will see now also in the Druidic form existed today that we tend to kind of overlook because we didn't have the means to preserve, especially through the media that were more frequent at that time rather than historiography. It was something relatively new in importantly primitive words, including, as we have seen, the Roman one that didn't like original literature more than much. In any case, also to look a bit at the map here, the territory of the Aedui was pretty much in the Gallic heartland, as we've seen, was situated between the Saône and the Loire rivers, in a strategic position regarding trade routes, because this was literally the center between Germany, the Gallia Belgica, also Britain in the north, Celtiberia, southern Gaul, the Mediterranean, Cisalpine Gaul, Rome, and the Danube as well towards the east. We made a similar video about this Kordisky, and we've seen how much actually was sent upriver in terms also of civilizational output of art, even as far as Germany, from those Celto-Thracian areas. So the Aedui controlled not just this, as we'll see, important waterway net, but, and especially an important part of the traffics rising up the Rhone River towards from the Mediterranean to Central Europe, but also a particularly fertile area, as Burgundy we've seen also in medieval times being wine production. But there's much you wouldn't probably be surprised about Gallic mythology and deities related to that, and that's quite interesting because it's connected, as we will see now, also with the the Chthonic Dionysian character that the Romans at least associated with the Druidic cults, that is in fact present, as we see also from the archaeological finds, given that of course the Gauls didn't have a literature on their own, and that was anti-ideological as far as the Uranian Universal Empire was concerned. There were mixtions with that, but the Druidic resistance was, as you know, put down by the Romans, that were extremely pragmatic-minded people for a very specific reason. In any case, the Aeduan territory included most of the modern the French departments of the Saône et Loire and Nièvre in the southwestern part of the Côte d'Or between Beaune and Saulieu, as well as the southern part of the Yonne around Avallon, corresponding essentially to the Saône Plains, the Morvan granitic massif, and also the low Nivernais plateau from east to west. The Aedui dwelled between, politically internationally, the Arverni in the west, the Segusiavi and the Ambari in the south, the Sequani in the east, and the Lingones and the Senones in the north. These were especially the ones in the north and in the west, other important central Gallic powers that were, as we've seen, also importantly developed. It could field an important amount of moral and material resources, but that had also for this reason grown somehow more gentrified, and thus more vulnerable, as the Cimbrian Teutonic migration had, for example, showed, right, with essentially the Germans touring the entire Gaul, and just even internationally showing also the Romans how permeable this area was, because up to that point, that the Romans had made of the Gaul the prototype of the warlike barbarian that the great Roman heroes had crushed in their sagas, etc. And so Gaul was just renowned, also because there were important contexts, of course, as this overwhelmingly populated and agriculturally productive area. The same Caesar appreciated the fact that if the Gauls had had the force to unite in a single power, they would have allegedly conquered the world, right? But they hardly could for their political, social development, after all. And that's the reason also why this enormous area was conquered by the Romans de facto in just 8 years and would remain under Rome for good, for half a millennium. And with, as we've seen, essentially in absolute terms, the single most successful result of Romanization outside Italy. The upper Liga, that would be the Loire, in Latin, formed the Aeduan western border, let's say, separating them from the Bituriges as well, while the Arar, that is the Saône, from their eastern border, separating them from the Sequani, who were just across, right? Well, the waterways were mostly controlled by the Aedui. That is fair to say, again, in this central Gallic reality, were the most powerful, the richest Gauls of all, and we will see it now also in the Commentari, the Bello Gallico, of course. 3 Aeduan oppida, so fortified hilltops, but here, they're pretty massively so compared to the Celtic average, are known from, in fact, the end of the Latin period, that, as you know, witnessed an important expansion, especially in those areas. We're talking about Verdun, that is Dun le Place, Le Fou de Verdun, that is Le Vau de Fretois, and Bibracte, which occupied a central position in the Aeduan economic system, and was also a notable Druidic school, as we will see. The name Bibracte is a Celtic collective noun based on the root biber, which literally means beaver, hence the place of beavers, animals that are naturally connected with a chthonic dimension of a river. In Celtic mythology, there are also somehow demons, and there are different types of representation, and we will talk at the end about the meaning of these river deities. Bibracte was prominently cited as these Celtic oppida were strategically on a hilltop commanding an important route nexus. The defended area covered some 135 hectares and required over 5 kilometers of ramparts to be built and maintained, the famous Murus Gallicus that Caesar describes in his Commentari. Caesar, describing the same Bibracte, says that it was by far the largest and richest oppidum of the Aedui. And the oppidum was divided in various areas. Naturally, the majority of the people actually lived outside of it, and in case of war, they would, as also the Commentari de Bello Gallico beautifully describe, kind of enclose themselves with their possessions in the fortified area, was divided in various areas. The artisans' quarters show archaeologically evidence of elaborate metallurgy of the Aedui. The central residential quarter contained many elaborate houses, partly imitating the Roman urban house type, replete with a central open area such as the atrium and a garden enclosed by a small colonnade. Right, and this tells you already how much, aside from the obvious process of Romanization that started after Caesar's conquest, but how wealthy the Aeduan aristocracy was, and we will see also, in fact, how much involved they were in the broader Gallic politics, as far as especially an hegemonic project on the region was concerned, and this is why also the Romans were so deeply connected with them. In Bibracte, also pre-Roman coinage was found inside the walls. In fact, the oppidum was also a mint, and a coin mold forecasting 25 blanks was found on the site. Each quarter had its own temple. Remember the aforementioned Latin Ides as far as the linguistic similarity, of course, with Gallic, that is dramatic. In this case, but the second Latin declension is identical to the Gallic one. So, of course, there was already in ancient times an important proximity between, as we will see also from Livy, between literally Transalpine Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul, and consequently also with the Italics in the south. During the Roman period, Bibracte, as we will see, would be abandoned for Augustodunum, so the fortress of Augustus. The modern-day Autun would become, in fact, the main center of the Aedui in Roman times. And other important Aeduan centers were Gorgobina, what would become the contemporary Mahon, Noviodunum, that is contemporary Nevers, Decetia, and Cebilionum, that is today's Chalon-sur-Saône. According to Livy, the Aedui had taken part in the expedition of Bellovesus into Italy in the 6th century BC, right? So even before the major Celtic settlement in the peninsula in the following centers. And in another passage, the same author mentions that the invading Celts on this occasion, quote, having learned that they were in what was known as the territory of the Insubres, the same name as one of the cantons of the Aedui, took it as a favorable omen and founded the town of Mediolanum. This is interesting because Mediolanum is here, of course, a Celtic foundation as well. In fact, the Insubres were inhabiting in the same region. It would be in today's Lombardy. The name of the center meaning settlement between the rivers, which in the surroundings of Milan, it's actually the case, and the possible implication of this Livian passage, given the as you understand what were the successions of multiple Celtic migrations in the area, is that the Insubres, as Celts who occupied the territory south of what is identifiable as the Gola Secca culture, just north of the Po River, at the time of the main Celtic migration, may have been, in fact, Celtic community long established in the region, coming originally from, in fact, an Aeduan canton, right? So this would make these two Transalpine and Cisalpine areas, respectively, quite connected, right, since a very long time. And this, again, axis essentially from Rome to Milan to Paris, also as far as we have seen in the 6th century, in the 7th century, eventually the Carolingian times, was always incredibly strong, right? Throughout, in fact, Roman times as well, and as you understand here, even before that, right? Part of the reason being this important context, the remarkable Celtic trade network, right, that crossed, in fact, all this Central European area. But it's something also beyond that, right? We often underestimate how much international politics was there at the time, right? And these peoples were not just some randomly scattered populations across the continent. It was already an important connection between them. Now, during the Latin era, outside the Roman province, so literally today's Provence, so the southern France, and what was composed at the time also as the Gallia Narbonensis from Narbo Martius, today's Narbonne, and also prior to the same Roman rule, Gaul was inhabited by essentially self-governing tribes divided into cantons, each canton being further divided into communes. So these were essentially villages united in some sort of leagues that eventually brought their aristocracies to higher levels, to ruling over multiple ones and having an hegemony over the main center, and thus making things work by cooptation, hierarchy. And again, the Aedui are perhaps the best example in absolute terms among not just the Gauls but the Celts altogether. The Aedui, like other powerful tribes in the region, such as the Arverni, the Sequani, and the Helvetii, had replaced their monarchy, which is a big word, at least as far as the entire territorial entity is concerned. So the word multiple reges, as the Roman terminology was applied also for the Suebi that we will see now, but it's the suffix rix in all the various Gallic leaders, whose name we don't know, because again these were political names, right? Rebeals in any case. And this monarchy had been replaced essentially with a council of, call it magistrates, the Roman way, called grand judges of some sort. And these grand judges were under the authority of a senate, right, made up of the descendants of ancient royal families. So the political institutional profile is quite interesting, because aside from the obvious connections existing between the free men in the tribes as vassals of the heads of these noble families, as far as any political, social, or military interest exchange was concerned, you have essentially the structuring of a more hierarchical system in which fundamentally the great noble ancestral families recognized as such, even with this in fact divine ascendancy, because that's what they literally believed, that were a celestial race of some sort, were in subcontracting and or entrusting, given their power, their clienteles, the government of the tribes to other important figures, middlemen that had enriched themselves and could be also co-opted, marrying, for example, into these noble families and so on. The bounds here were relatively loose and uncategorizable, but it's evident that this structure was the most solid in the entire Celtic world, and it worked on a pretty large scale. In fact, the Gauls are de facto the only Celts that managed to coalesce in a league that goes beyond, say, even a regional dimension, even though too late, right? Just when the Romans were about to take over everything, right, during Vercingetorix's revolt. And the chief magistrate of the Aedui in Caesar time was called the Vergobretus. That is, according to Mommsen, sort of judgment worker, could be translated. Fair is a strengthening of the term. He was elected annually and possessed powers of life and death as a judge, but he was forbidden to exercise his authority beyond the frontiers of a given territory, right? It's actually a very powerful figure. Certain clientes or small communities were also dependent upon the Aedui as well. There were smaller tribes that were gradually controlled by the more powerful ones. And the Romans, documenting ethnographically the Aedui, spotted in their political institutional system something similar, after all, to their own Senate, right? And conceptually, the idea is the same. There is an oligarchic body of divine descent that supervises the work of other magistrates that fundamentally emerge out of their own imperium that is granted to. And so, of course, there was a sort of syntony in the broader traditional world of the time. Rome came in first historical contact with the Aedui. Naturally, there were previous before that we don't know of, but during her campaigns against the Ligurians, which had brought them across the Alps into conflict with the Allobroges, as we've seen, bordered the Aedui, and who refused to give up a refugee Ligurian chieftain. Before long, the Romans were involved with the Aedui, as they this people refused to support the Allobroges in resisting Rome, and they became, in fact, Roman allies against the pressuring Arverni that also were supporting the Allobroges. The Arverni were crushed by Quintus Fabius Maximus in 125 BC. And by Caesar's time, the Aedui had essentially attached themselves to the Romans and were honored with the title of brothers and kinsmen of the Roman people. So, an importantly old and solid bond, right? Rome at this point had essentially hegemonized the Mediterranean. Therefore, any people gravitating around it had to unavoidably establish relations with Rome, and it was importantly profitable for this Gallic tribe to win Rome's favor, given these, as we'll see now, troubling neighbors, and even aspiring to a broader hegemony over the entire Gaul on behalf of Rome. The situation was more complicated because the Gauls were divided chronically and were living exactly in those decades a crisis. Think about the aforementioned Cimbrian and Teutonic migration that showed how the Gauls were fundamentally helpless in front of these German invaders that had not identified Gaul specifically as a place to settle necessarily, but later on the German expansion was unavoidably bringing it in against the richest neighboring areas of Gaul, right? They were very different from Germany. This is not a Roman historiographical myth. There is, in Celto-Germanic terms, really an abyss in terms of difference of population, of productivity, and it's the same boundary that would bring Gaul to be, again, a clamorous success of Romanization, and Germany, a failure essentially, aside from some parts of it that were successfully Romanized along the frontier, and importantly so. In any case, there wasn't even like a radical difference in a immediately separated sense. I mean, of course, there was a gradation of civilization that you can appreciate even within the same Celts, or at least what we call as such, because peoples like the Aedui, the Arverni, etc., were again properly the Gauls. When we talk about the Helvetii or the Belgae, we realize that these were the peoples who fundamentally claimed the most like a sort of detachment from what was considered Gaul as such, and they were the proudest in terms of the claim of essentially a Germanic descent. They were essentially Celto-Germanic peoples, And for this reason, they were also the most politically cohesive, like the strong, which made their military strength, right? It's not that they fought in any particularly different way. There are maybe some slight, differences, but the Celts fought in the same identical way every single where, right? There's no such thing like, I don't know, those who fought closer to the Greeks fought more like phalanxes, or it's BS, right? There is just a different level of development. The least developed are the Britons by far, that you can measure also that with the permanence of chariot warfare. This admittedly existed also among the Belgians, that were essentially the same Britons from their continental side. But those were dramatically more cohesive because of the pressure posed by the Germans, and this is what fundamentally made them stronger than the others. And in fact, fundamentally, the Helvetian migration is what triggers, together with the Germanic pressure, the Roman intervention in Gaul, exactly to safeguard the Aedui, and the picture is evident, right? This Central Gauls are richer but weaker, and so they are the target of this other more brutal tribes from Central Europe that have already, for example, laid waste other Celtic areas, like for example the Boiaenum, populated by the Boii, we know had again an important level of development with Oppida, imports of precious metals as far as Spain. The Germans arrive, everything collapses, right? So this is actually for those that say, but no, these were all proud peoples resisting Romanization. Yeah, peoples that in fact remained with Rome for half of a millennium, instead then giving way to the Germanic tribes. And of course, they weren't particularly happy of the Roman presence as well, but many of them would actually become in the more developed areas, and that's where, in fact, Romanization functioned the best. And that's a powerful indicator of probably the differences that existed within the same Celtic world, and by which degree, right? So what eventually Rome takes over is a very precise type of community. In 71 BC, the Arverni and Sequani invited a Germanic tribe, the Suebi, into Celtic territory to help them against the Aedui. And when the Sequani defeated and massacred the Aedui at the Battle of Magetobriga in 63 BC with the assistance of the Germanic chieftain Ariovistus, which also, yes, is Germanic, but has an evidently Celtic name, which has to do with, in fact, the degree of civilization that the Celts had compared to the Germans, who would adopt, like they would do later during Romanization, in fact, Roman names themselves, so always the ones of the more powerful elements that could cope them in a way. The Aedui sent the Druid Diviciacus to Rome with an appeal to the Senate for help. However, his mission was unsuccessful. Rome was, busy and didn't have any particular reason to get involved directly in Gaul on large scale, because that would have entailed, in fact, a massive commitment that only with Caesar's personal ambition could have been possible in the area. And as you know, he would have not even chosen Gaul. He wanted Dacia because of the precious metal mines that would have been accomplished just by the conquest by Trajan, as you know. But that's essentially how also these theaters must be conceived in Roman mind, right? There would have been at the Bello Dacico if Caesar had, of course, been given the proconsulship of the Illyricum. And yet, that's the mean thanks to which we know so much, after all, about these peoples that otherwise would have not left essentially a documentation of themselves at that very point, in the way we can appreciate politically, socially, culturally through Roman literature. And consider that's the problem we have with any people, meaning the same Romans from some centuries before, had, as we often seen, just like a mythological and historical view mix, right? So we know more or less what happened, mostly also thanks to other civilized peoples, and so. As I always say, it's not Caesar's fault if the Gauls didn't have a literature. Yet, especially, they haven't quite achieved that level of development that could afford them having like such a thing in just a few centuries, like the Romans. And we often tend to, in fact, misappreciate the actual divide that existed between these populations. Of Central Europe and the ones of the Mediterranean, because the divide there is more than just a matter of shade, right? It's properly a different model of political organization, different society, and a much more unstable and resourceless one, right? Doesn't matter how the Celts stand out for their crafts, for their trades, and so on. They were really something else, right? And that's when I say that there wasn't even any substantial difference between Celts in general for the type of political, military, and social organization was concerned, right? It's really, we can't find this divides within, but it's still substantially distant from what populations like the Greeks, the Romans really were, and this is, I must say, the single most difficult thing to make people accept in general, because of course the Celts must be appreciated, and I've always had a particular attachment towards them since I was little, but exactly for this reason, pretending them to be kind of an occult, a scientific, technologistic civilization, destroyed and obscured by the terrible Roman propaganda is not compatible, I think, just with the dignity of human intelligence, but also with any literal historical evidence, because, even archaeologically speaking, because it is pretty clear to us what these peoples were. There is no conspiracy, or we don't just rely on what the Romans said, which also, telling the truth, has a positive bias towards the Gauls, as anybody who has studied Caesar's works perfectly knows. I mean, Caesar was trying to depict the Gauls as much more assimilable by Rome than they actually were, because of obvious popularist political reasons that are also the leitmotif of the Julio-Claudian dynasty eventually, and great part of the same success of Rome, because definitely these populations were ready to be Romanized. But this doesn't mean that there wasn't a divide, nor that this is a matter of personal preference, right? And this mission to Rome of Divitiacus, by the way, that we will see now better, essentially a Gallic leader of the Aedui, but also Druid, etc., is fascinating, because it shows, first of all, how much Rome was already receptive and welcoming of these political exiles, as the fact that Divitiacus was, and consider that his name in Gallic means literally the Avenger, right? And his support for Rome would be staunch. His friendship with Caesar also was particularly important, as we will see now. Yet this would begin to make Rome more aware what was happening in Gaul, and exploiting that successfully when the occasion arose. Dumnorix, which literally means king of the world, just to tell you like what the profile was when you say, again, these peoples were resisting Romanization because, what do you think they actually had in mind, right? These people, the only sole purpose why they existed was conquering the entire world. There was literally in the ancient world no other moral parameter of any kind, and frankly it's difficult to see why it shouldn't be the case even today. And of course they were boasting these names also with evident comparison against other peoples that it wasn't quite the case. But the only sole absolute identity of these people couldn't be anything else but constantly conquering, enslaving, and subjugating other peoples in the first place, right? So just always make comparisons, and I don't know really why we look at the ancient works and times as if I don't know, there was somebody who was just doing what exactly, trying to affirm today's human rights for what, of course, they are also created for purposes that have barely to do with themselves, right? But to guarantee certain balance and stability that can allow, of course, further power to expand, and not that there are better options than that fundamentally. So people, as you know, and I always say out loud in my channel, are brutally confused, right? We cannot rely on the average person anymore by under any cultural, moral, personal degree, and starting from having an actual historical literacy, if it was just one of primary education, would make things much better, right? And most adults today do not have any of this. So Dumnorix was a prince of the Aedui. He was a successful financier, so it's a good figure as far as how power and wealth was acquired in this world. And in fact, he has had assembled a considerable following as well. He was the brother of the same Divithiacus, was a tribal leader. As you understand, they were part of the same clan, same group, but had opposed his brother's rise, as we've seen, and for this reason, in 60 BC, would flee to Rome for good, at least to remain eventually with Caesar, even during the invasion of Gaul, etc. And that's when he made friends with Cicero's brother, Quintus Tullius Cicero, and also with Cicero Marcus Tullius as well. More of that later. In any case, Divithiacus claimed that Dumnorix planned essentially to take over first the Aedui and later the Wall of Gaul. And for this reason, he had allied himself secretly with some chieftains of the Sequani, and even of the Helvetii, right, to evidently take power internally, even against other factions, given that these peoples were traditionally not really friends with each other. So, of course, it was an eminently political thing. And this was actually the reason why the Germanic Suebi had been allowed at this point, even by the Aedui, that, as we've seen, had suffered an important military defeat. Also thanks to the Germanic involvement in Gallic politics in the land that would be today's one of Alsace, right? And in return, the same Germanic troops would have served as auxiliaries under Dumnorix. So the idea is that, of course, this powerful ruler could even buy mercenaries from the same forces that crushed his own people, and controlling it more direct. There was a plot that was discovered eventually, and this also caused a great scandal for the Aeduan stability that was warring the same Rome. And Dumnorix, in fact, strenuously opposed the alliance with the Romans, also because he had understood that time had come, which, given Roman politics, internal affairs, Caesar could have been interested in Gaul, and sooner or later, Rome would have surely stepped into central Gaul, because technically they were already bound to the Romans, right? The Romans had established the control in the south of Gaul that had undergone Romanization now from generations, and thus the Romans controlled politically these peoples. They asked them tributes, as we'll see now, mostly actually even economic military support, right? There were legionary supplies that were provided by the Aedui and other Gauls, but also mercenaries, of course, from the same Gallic world. Julius Caesar's operations in Gaul really began with the Aedui, or for the Aedui. In his introduction to the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Caesar states that the Aedui were, at the time, one of the strongest Gallic tribes in rivalry, as we've seen with the Helvetii, the Sequani, also the Remi in the north, and the Arverni. In 58 BC, Dumnorix convinced the Sequani to grant passage into their territory to the Helvetii, who had decided to migrate from their territories to other areas, specifically on the Atlantic. So they would have had to cross the entire Gaul, and the Aedui laid in the middle, and they, because of those agreements that we talked about before, at least Dumnorix had thought that this migration could happen smoothly and or damaging the properties of only some other Aeduan chiefs to aggrandize his power. There were many upheavals. Because of this, that were destabilizing the entire region, so much so that Caesar, as soon as he was elected governor of the Gallia Narbonensis, opposed this migration by force of arms, asking, among other things, the Aedui, as Roman allies, to think about supplies for his legionnaires. The request order was not accepted willingly by the Gallic tribe. Meanwhile, Liscus, Vergobretus of the Aedui, revealed to Caesar that it was the influential and popular Dumnorix who had caused the delay in supplies. The Helvetii were, as we were saying before, a powerful Celto-Germanic tribe, right, who was also looking at Gaul as a new land of settlement. They had already arranged their migration in the lands of the Santones, and naturally none of this was done, just harmoniously with everybody living in peace. It was just a brutal game of force in which this population could migrate somewhere more profitable and at that point controlling the subjects. At other times, for example, as it had happened with parts of the Boii that had been dislodged from Central Europe, that these, for example, entered in the same orbit of the Aedui and of the Helvetii. We may make videos about them because they are interesting among these populations. But the Helvetii were pretty warlike, and Caesar tells that, in fact, were the strongest among the Gauls, that everybody feared them. Eventually, the Belgae would be the toughest, but he made it quite clear that crushing the Helvetii could show all the other Gauls essentially what Rome was made of. And what happened is that the Helvetii asked to just cross the Roman territory to Caesar, who refused, and thus they decided eventually to pass on Dumnorix's suggestion through the Sequani, who gave them passage, and the Helvetii proceeded to the lands of the Aedui, which they, however, thoroughly ravaged. And this tells you also how, somehow paralyzed the same Aedui were by this internal political division as well. After his arrival in Gaul in 58 BC, Caesar famously crushed the Helvetii. He had first essentially locked the routes that could pass through from the Roman side. Then he literally crushed them militarily, and there is this massive display of Roman force. The idea that, of course, the Helvetii were moving in mass with also their children, the entire population. And if these, it took like 10 times longer to march than Caesar's army, that was particularly apt in forced marches, as the Bello Gallico just forced it to be, given the political and strategic situation. I made multiple videos about the Gallic Wars, but we will have to make others, especially highlighting the masterful counterinsurgent strategy that Caesar enabled in those campaigns, which is nothing short of extraordinary. And it does make sense also considering, in fact, what the broader achievements really were, so hardly just propaganda as people would like to make you believe. And Caesar crushes the Helvetii in battle, and this opens naturally the way to Gaul, because if this force could simply ravage in the territories of some of the most powerful Gallic tribes unopposed, right? And it was wiped out so easily by Rome. Like now, there was hardly anyone who could, especially alone, try to stop the Romans. And that's the situation in which, of course, the Gauls understand perfectly well that Caesar, while being there namely to help his allies, is actually taking over the country. In any case, he necessarily needed a Gallic support, because otherwise the Romans could have never nor conquered nor maintained Gaul historically. And the Aedui and the Arverni and the Remi, who had themselves allied to Caesar's cause, prospered, in fact, in this initial phase, and expanded their territories at the expense of other peoples. While most other tribes were instead made poorer, right, at very least, by the annual tribute of 400,000 gold pieces, which they now had to pay to Rome. Right, Rome again was incredibly pragmatic in all this. Even after the wars, the rebellions, there were times which she spared some rebels, as we will see now, even with the Aedui, and wiped out others who had stood aside because in that balance were not useful. So it's, as you know, one of the single bloodiest stories, right, and wars of the ancient times. And we have this astonishing privilege to have been passed down to us historiographically by the same commander that carried them out. So it's really something, and you can appreciate Caesar's propaganda as much as the accomplishments were concrete, as we pointed out. Against the Belgae, Caesar could count on the assistance of contingents from the Aedui and other friendly tribes. So Caesar made famously he crushed the Suebi. He made his raid in Germany, for which the frontier was stabilized. They didn't try to cross anymore. The same was done with Britain, right, with the expeditions of 55-54, that in terms of deterrence were extremely successful, in spite, they wouldn't bring to any permanent occupation and basically much of any other, even say, economical advantage. And the greater part of Roman power in Gaul had been directed towards the expedition across the Channel in order to prevent revolts in the continent. Dumnorix at this point had been brought as an unwilling traveling companion along with the others as guarantees of their compatriots' passivity during Caesar's absence in Britain. In 54 BC, however, Dumnorix escaped with his Aeduan cavalry, but was pursued, captured, and executed. Right, in this show-off, when he claimed to be essentially a free man in a free land. And Caesar, when asked by his soldiers whether he wanted Dumnorix alive or dead, said that it didn't matter. And that shows, of course, the contempt towards the guy that was essentially in the wake of, in fact, what ancient law really was concerned in terms of the strongest has to rule. Like, if you first subject to Rome and you're all nice and friendly, even just as a matter of facade, but then you betray because you evidently want to rise, well, you are like a lesser person, because what the Romans loved terribly was when people said oppose directly themselves. They fought, they take their chance, so they wouldn't bend to anyone, and they would take their, in fact, chance even against the odds. as the Romans were really something else. But at that point, the Romans would, after all, usually respect these people, and so even though they imposed them heavy regime, they wouldn't have any reason to expressly torture them further, right? And there are successful examples of Romanization that happened like this. After all, the same Gauls underwent this fate in a general sense. But when again you first showed friendly and then you betrayed it, you were done for in many ways. And the Aedui, however, at least an important part of them, were deeply angered by the death of the monarchs, and this was a big deal because, as we've seen, the guy was very powerful. It was a pivotal figure of essentially the most important tribe in Gaul, and he embodied essentially the, at least in potential, the figure who could bond with Rome more highly, at a higher level. So his killing was seen by not just the Aedui, but also many other Gauls as, a terrible affront that was evidently making all the various unsettled questions of the Roman presence in Gaul surfacing. This is what caused, among the various things, the Arvernian rebellion, led by Vercingetorix Rex, which means fair, great. Cingetos are the soldiers, as Rex is like the king or leader, like meant in that kind of magic, sacred sense of power. And we don't know how it was called otherwise, but the names again are quite eloquent if you read them etymologically. And at this point, the Aedui were still fundamentally under Rome. They hadn't rebelled. After which, Vercingetorix didn't try to crush Caesar, but he could have done it, right? So it's one of the many cases in which Caesar's fortuna as a religion of his, and I made a video specifically about this, embodied also part of the Clausewitzian concept of the gamble and the second element of the Trinity. In any case, the Aedui began to distance themselves from Rome. At least there was a political strife about this. In fact, it began like a pet internal dispute among the people, which eventually grew into something bigger. In fact, there were essentially two candidates for the post of chief magistrate among the Aedui, and the two were at each other's throats, to put it mildly. One was Convictolitavis, a wealthy young noble, right? The other was Cottus, a widely connected politician whose brother had held the post the previous year. And Caesar was concerned that the dispute would weaken the Aedui when he needed their support the most. Right? Always read these sources as literally an ABC of political education. You cannot be militarily strong if you're politically divided. It's not about technology, it's consequently also about numbers, the way you can apply your forces, doctrine, whatever, but it's primarily about moral forces. War is a clash between moral forces. And Caesar, at this point, decided to journey in person at the Aeduan center of the Caria to resolve the dispute, and announcing Cottus ineligible for the office under Aeduan law. Right? It's interesting that, of course, as a broader signory, the Gauls entrusted Caesar, who had showed abundantly to hold the imperium in the universal religion of the time, to settle their disputes. This, however, was a mistake. Because Caesar, of course, is describing this also from his own perspective, where he basically prefers the major political support, the immediate closure, as opposed to giving a chance to what appears to be actually, promising young men that embodied also in the Roman mentality, this sense of the, a bit of this Alexandrian heroic fortune, right? So a better disposed candidate as far as his divine potential was concerned. But he understood also that at that very moment he could not push for this guy. However, within a month, Convicto Lithabes had already accepted cash bribes from the Arverni and began to openly preach for the Aedui to abandon the treaty with Rome. And within another month, the Aedui defected, and Caesar was thus left abandoned by his most powerful Gallic ally, thus isolated in an hostile land with no immediate sources of supply of support, cut off from his lieutenant Labienus in the north. This is the phase of scorched earth strategy that the Arverni begin to carry out, and that was supported importantly by the same Aedui. On the initiative of whom, in fact, a general council of the tribes of Gaul was called at the same Bibracte. Only the Remi and the Lingones decided to maintain their alliance with Rome, and this is to be noticed as well. The rest decided that the time had come to rebel, right? Naturally, the Gallic logic was very simple, right? What would happen to you, right? If you're risking annihilation, or participating to one block or another would have just given more power to your more immediately problematic neighbor, right? You would tend to stick. Also, generally, the less powerful tribes, but in this case with Rome, not necessarily. Some other Gallic tribes here just sided with the Arverni because they were pressured by Rome and by her impositions, but also because the Arverni were otherwise threatening them. As you know, there was a general Gallic union at this point, right? Vercingetorix was the leader of an almost completely unified Gaul, and in history, not just against the Romans. That evidently gave a good reason for the Gauls to finally unite after this chronic political fragmentation, yet it would prove not to be enough. Caesar found himself in trouble, as you know, because the Gauls were really numerically superior to him. They were fighting in their own land. They knew the territory. They could successfully prevent the Romans from foraging in many circumstances, and this put a strain on Caesar, who was also being left alone by the Senate in Rome and had to rely just on a contained amount of resources and troops, and that's where some of the finest accomplishments of the century-old Roman military machine were put at work in extraordinary fashion. We'll talk about this in some other videos, but the Gallic Wars are, thanks to Caesar's work, the greatest epopees and sources for it. I don't know how many times I read it myself, but it's really showing you what the hardcore necessities of a leader in a campaign really are. In the Council of Bibracte, Vercingetorix had been appointed as commander-in-chief or war leader of all the Gallic armies, and Caesar gives us precise numbers for the Celtic tribes which had responded to Vercingetorix's call for help. Right, the numbers are difficult to believe, and that's where you can obviously see that they are inflated for propagandistic reasons. But it doesn't mean in practice, like any other ancient source, that this actually doesn't tell you more or less. Yes, it means that the Gauls were substantially superior in number to the Romans, and why wouldn't they be? Right, the larger the armies are, the more evenly balanced the numbers are. But the Romans tendentially invested more on quality than quantity, and that's the reason also why like all the great conquerors in history prevailed, were more numerous but disorganized enemies. By Caesar's account, his army counted 50,000 Romans and auxiliaries, prevail over a Celtic host of over 250,000 men, which is ridiculous because anything more than 50,000 is just a logistical miracle. It probably at the time it doesn't work. It's possible that in fact the Saint Romans were not as many at all, and that the Celtic numbers weren't surpassing. Let's say they could have mobilized more than 50,000. Yes, it is possible, especially from the entire Gaul. But at the same time, this was also a bit against their own interest. I mean, this was the last great effort. They could have surely squeezed also the demographics as far as they were concerned. But it was important also to be military effective. Caesar gives this detail that the Aedui, with their dependent tribes, the Segusiavi, the Ambivareti, the Olerchi, the Brannovicas, and the Blannovi, counted 35,000 men. And what is important here is that they were the largest Gallic contingent, right? So the Aedui were central in the struggle against Rome at the siege of Alesia. During the war, together with the Arverni, however, a part of the Aedui stuck with Caesar. For example, Vercingetorix's forces captured the small Aeduan garrison town of Noviodunum on the Loire, to which Caesar had sent Gallic hostages captured in previous battles, stores of grain and coin, and even some of his personal baggage. Well, the Arverni stripped the town. Accordingly, they massacred the garrison of Noviodunum, so also the Aedui that were there, and the merchants who lived there. They shared the money and horses, and had all the hostages taken to the magistrates of the Aeduan allies of Bibracte, that evidently had participated also to crush those compatriots, let's say, that had been serving with Caesar, and carried away also as much grain as they had time to stow into boats. The riverways were quite important. To rest being thrown into the river or burned, not to make them used by the Romans, and so trying to literally make a desert around them. Noviodunum itself, the Arverni thought they could not possibly hold, so they burned it down to prevent it being of use to the Romans as well. So a ferocious struggle that tells you how, of course, much the same goals were shaken down, what was really at stake, and as they had finally understood. And at the siege of Alesia, the relieving Gallic army was led by a quartet of commanders. There were Commius, a king of the Atrebates, who had formerly been an ally of Rome as well, Viridomarus and Eporedorix, that were Aeduan kings, right? So you understand here there were different, again, reges, and Vercassivellaunus, who was Vercingetorix's cousin. After the surrender of Vercingetorix at the Battle of Alesia, that more or less how it unfolded, the Romans took prisoner and sold into slavery the Gallic garrison force and the relief force. Apart, however, from allegedly probably there were less, but Caesar says 20,000 warriors of the Aedui and Arverni tribes, interestingly enough, were pardoned and released by Caesar. And this was done in order to secure the alliance of those two the most important tribes in Gaul to Rome. And the Aedui, in this sense, gladly returned to their Roman allegiance. Right? It would be just Augustus later who to dismantle their capital, Bibracte, on the Mont Beauvray, and constructed the new town with a half Roman, half Gaulish name, Augustodunum, the modern Autun. So Gaul, as you know, after Caesar's campaigns remained under Rome. We'll see now that there were some troubles still occurring in the 1st century AD, but this wouldn't give, say, the start to any broader scale rebellion. It's meaningful that the Aedui, however, were involved, right? Because they evidently had maintained an important power in the same goal, and probably also aggrandized it compared to the other Gallic peoples, most of which had been essentially exhausted by the war and ended up under the Roman administration, and this local Gallic clientele to be part just to, to lose their power in practice. And in fact, of the northern troubles which occurred between the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest and the accession of Emperor Claudius, the most serious was in 20 AD, when major portions of the Treveri, they were a Celto-Germanic tribe living essentially across the Moselle, and the Aedui came out in rebellion. Tacitus is our main information about the revolt, and 2 leaders distinguished themselves in their respective tribes: Julius Florus of the Treveri and Sacrovir, a prince of the Aedui. You understand also what these names are, right? They are Roman, right? Even though they are part of the Gallic nobility. These 2 organized a rebellion which promised a serious dislocation of Roman rule, and by touch of irony, both leaders bore the name of Julius, right? As, for example, Arminius did, and his brother. And there's always this theme you see between Divitiacus and Dumnorix, for example, of the pro-Roman and the anti-Roman barbarian there that represent a different stance on Romanization that were not either accepted or refused in bloc for obvious reasons. Both Julius Florus and Sacrovir were of the Romanized establishment of the Celtic nobility. They were well acquainted at this point with the problems faced by the Roman government in Gaul that existed from 3/4 of a century, and planned to exploit these. Both seemed shrewd enough to know that without the help of defecting Roman soldiers from the legions, they had no hope of victory. I think it is particularly interesting because there were many Celto-Romans now as properly legionnaires, as Roman citizens. And at this point, in fact, in the 1st century AD, up to 30% of the Roman legionnaires, not talking about auxilia, but were of Celto-Roman background, right? Of course, the majority of them were essentially descendants of the Italics that had been settled in the colonies in northern Italy, in Transalpine Gaul at this point as well. But the fact that these men had married into the local women, they had become, in a sense, partly Celt themselves, but they were more importantly Roman citizens, and proudly so from both sides. And this is valued also from the descendants of the Celts, the Germans, that in many cases here stuck with Rome, because they understood what that meant in a universal imperial sense, to be part of and to own that power. And in a species of double bluff, Sacrovir at one point even urged the Celts to fight on the Roman side, which shows the degree of commixtion to which they could even try to mix cards in the field. As we know, right, there had been a big deal of Celtic influence, for example, on Roman arms and armor, especially after the Gallic wars, but the same was true for the Gauls. However, according to Tacitus, morale on the Celtic side was low. Right, the forces of the Treveri and the Aedui were insufficiently trained and equipped to face regular Roman units with any hope of success. Consider that naturally there were many auxilia fighting in the Roman army from these tribes, but it was different, right, than the legionnaires, right? Those we often think that they were just distinguished by a different degree of training and equipment. there is an important divide, which we think, of course, that the Romans invested more resources in the legions, right? The auxilia were just there to test themselves, but they were, yes, even though numerically superior, still they were not the decisive element. Important too, and this had to do mostly with the fact that they tended to fight in their traditional styles, which, given also the same type of course, of equipment, availability, etc., of their peoples was more modest, also like in collective training and so on, because this had been already conquered by Rome, importantly enough. So we know, even in times of later on with some foreign guards, that they often were still armed in their traditional fashion, not just with, of course, some Roman arms and armor that they could be equipped with, right? So there are different shades, and still, of course, we're looking at a much more primitively poor world, like the entire ancient world really is, compared to what we could think as even just in terms of uniformity, for example. So the distinction between the heavier guys, fully trained one, etc., and the auxilia was still evident, right, on average. So it's actually correct to say that. Just don't exceed by thinking that in absolute terms they weren't, because there were even elite elements, elite units from the auxilia. The Aedui came out more strongly in revolt. This is to be pointed out. So there was definitely something there burning under the ashes. However, they were also overcome without particular problem. They did manage to seize Augustodunum, for example, and for a while to even hold it. It's interesting that Sacrovir was able to recruit there many students from distinguished Celtic families that were being Romanized by maintaining a part of their own traditional education, as we will see now. The army of the Aedui had many soldiers who, according to Tacitus, were as well equipped as the legionaries of Rome. In fact, some former gladiatorial slaves were so heavily armored that the Roman soldier could only kill them with hatchets and pickaxes. It was the crupellari, right? The equivalent of some sort of medieval knight almost, but also somehow cumbersome considering the equipment that we don't know in detail, but we could imagine. In any case, this was not enough, as Sacrovir's defeat was crushing. He and his followers were killed themselves in Augustodunum. Right, they had set the town on fire, and Romanized though many of them undoubtedly were, their death has an element of primitive ritual in it. In fact, in following the ancient custom of the defeated leader's ritual of suicide, the two rebels not only made a last assertion of national honor, but avoided the shameful fate of being executed by the Romans. And we may recall the stories of ancient Irish heroes perishing in the conflagration of their Bruidne. That would be a sort of brothel, right? And it's like the whole, like also in the the Germanic epos, right, where they fight to the last, to the death, drinking their own blood in this in fact military brothership, as they swore oath also to the gods for this. They had devoted themselves. This is a very important element that of course existed in the Celtic as in the Roman world, and that however these goals, as we were saying the other day in the video about the virtus, appear to the Romans much more mystically connected in this way, and in some, for the same fact that this entire religion revolved around real power and probably victory and the right of the vanquisher to rule on the defeated. It still seemed like a proof of inferiority, like as the ultimate trial, right? So it was a way to show that they could commit themselves to the last in the hope of saving the cause by essentially committing the greatest sacrifice. But this had not been enough, and this is a memento to all those who think like, how much is enough, right, to divinely transfigure in an apotheosis in traditional religion. Well, not even killing yourself technically is enough, because who are you? What did you accomplish, right? It was an enormous deal, right? And it speaks of the tragic fall of mankind in general. But it's, this is a bit like the storming of the Asgard, right? These Celts, again, that thought to be even Germanic in origins, would probably see this last stand as the most exalting death possible, and it's brutally romantic if you think about that. And of course, the symbol of Augusta Dunum, so a Romano-Celtic reality that had been badly digested evidently by elites that were technically the most eager to be Romanized at a point to profit locally, but that also hoped for some space of, some autonomy still at that point, which is interesting because we know, again, in perspective, that Gaul remained safely under Rome. But in practice, it still shows that Romanization took time, and that was evidently not yet accomplished, at least by a standard would prevent such revolts from happening. There is a distinct Gallic identity, of course, that remains. Also in the Roman provinces later on, there is the Empire of Gauls, etc. But that is something like, it's not considered antagonistically with Rome. It's just like saying we want our own autonomy, but yes, we are still Romans, it's still the empire, right? But that happened naturally in the 3rd century. We're distant from here. And in fact, in spite of this, we should point out what, the importance that these peoples had, even within Romanization, the space that the rulers had left to their autonomy. For example, when on August the 1st, 12 BC, Drusus established the cult of Rome and Augustus just outside Lugdunum, the ceremony was presided over by the chief priest of the Aedui, Gaius Julius Vercondaridubnus, which represent some kind of shared identity, right? Politically, religiously, we've seen that the Aedui had been, already elevated by the Romans to a sort of kin people. From an important amount of time, they were embracing the same Roman ancestral origins, right, out of prestige and power. The Aedui were also, and most importantly, the first of the Gauls to receive from the Emperor Claudius the distinction of jus honorum, so to access the age of honors in the Roman hierarchy, and consequently being the first Gauls permitted to become Roman senators. This is very important in Julio-Claudian politics that we haven't made too many videos on, telling the truth, and we must absolutely reinforce, because especially Gaul is a very important base on which probably the Augustan era and Julio-Claudian policy, as far as the Romanization, the granting of citizenship, the provincial administration rests for the solidity of the entire empire. So the Aedui were central in this as well. In the process, it's also obvious that these people adopted many of the governmental practices of the Romans, such as electing magistrates and other officials in the Roman guise. However, it was part of the natural development of their own political system that, as we've seen, already entailed a sort of senate, sort of magistrates, and so was also more easily integratable by the Romans. We talked before about the Withiacus and the Druids. So who were these figures? Well, I should make a video about the Druids per se, and we should point out also that these were, again, aside from what pop culture has made them, an equivalent you can find in many other cultures, including the Roman one. The Arvales were the Roman Druids, except nobody has ever, popularized the Arvales. And of course, the Druids represent, together with the Celts, a different point of reference for most people today, because of course of the narrative that has been grafted on their memory. But very often it's these initiatives that do not start from even the basic historical or religious knowledge are, really leaving the weather they find. In any case, the Druids are remarkably important in this Romano-Celtic relations, and should trace a minimal profile. And I don't boast any completion here. So the Druids were a priesthood, right? They were part of a world in which these spiritual figures were somehow blended with the rest, right? There's not a rigid division, actually, as you can see even in the Roman world, between kind of a spiritual function and a political one. It's all together, right? Just there is a further specialization that brings them to be, as far as the Romans described them as essentially the guardians of a wisdom, and of a particularly extensive and complex and structured one that was functional to essentially the preservation, especially of an aristocratic establishment, which was skilled in various capacities of government, of war, also of natural science. More of this later. The importance of the Druids in the Celtic world is witnessed just by the role that they had, the privileges that they enjoyed. There are differences within the Celtic world, but speaking of the Gauls, like we do today, we can observe their various benefits, as for example being exempt from tax, or not being required compulsorily to offer military service. Albeit Diviciacus, for example, brother of the ruler of the Aedui, as we've seen, is also fighting men, as Cicero assures us. I realized that I also didn't make a broader picture of what essentially Gallic society was about, rather than the politics, because the aforementioned process of political institutional development and proto-urbanization and proto-statalization went in parallel with, again, an increasing power of the elites, at the detriment of the lower strata of the population. Gaul had even a sort of proto-feudal system going on, right? The free warrior, except from areas that were, again, less socially stratified and more warlike, as we've seen, like among the Belgians, for example, was just now a serf, technically, a colonist living in somebody's estates, right? An estates of the nobility that now had basically monopolized control, hired more professional war bands than the initial kind of tribal levies really were. They had large estates, large cattle. They were obsessed with horses, horsemanship. It was all an aristocratic business, and shrouded by also an incredibly warlike, mystical ethos of the elite, of individual force and strength. Thus, it was important to also, again, preserve this power through a creed, a set of knowledge, of rituals, of powers, in fact, that were proper of that nobility. The privileges of the Druidic class attracted many pupils that were, in fact, mostly from the aristocracy. They would be required to spend 20 years studying the doctrine, and if you're a peasant, how the hell can you do that? And learning everything by heart, according to Caesar, who states that this was not done just to train the mind, but also to essentially keep the others distant from this knowledge that eventually required some initiation. The aristocracy was jealous of right? And this is also why we get that they didn't write it down in part, even though, as you know, famously when Caesar crushed the Helvetii, he seized their wagons, and he found there that before leaving they had made a list of all the stuff that they were bringing with them, and they had written it down in Hellenic letters, Hellenic script, and this is interesting because it shows, of course, they could handle writing, because, of course, writing did exist. Even the Germans had the Futhark. Just they used writing in a very different way from which, say, the Greeks and the same Romans did at that point, and it was just much rarer and kind of unnecessary, even if you consider again what you can do with just memory, which we tend to underestimate brutally, right? Also the Romans did so. Like, again, what they wrote, mostly aside from administration, etc., it was most like a cultural tendency. Caesar wrote down so much. He was also a talented poet. Just like in the Celtic tradition, like the bard is also to be a warrior, commander involved, and that's exactly what the druid, in a sense, represented, albeit in a more categorized way. So, of course, this knowledge was hidden by a certain degree, and eventually also persecuted, as we will see now, because it's based on this knowledge that the resistance against Rome continued under some aristocrats, either abroad, and that's the reason why Caesar, for example, landed in Britain to discourage, as it successfully happened, the Britons to from interfering in Gaul, right, supporting the Gauls. There is a relation now between Britain and Gaul that we should point out, because it seems that Druidic doctrine stemmed essentially from the British Isles, that, as you know, had an ever more important Druidic say cultural complex, we can say, even though they were a more primitive reality. And that's also how we should understand this, because pop culture has somehow categorized this as a sort of easy knowledge you can use in the broader Celtic world, like as a sort of precise set of, I don't know, math, science, but it was actually all one, because we are, of course, a bunch of imbeciles that just think that everything gets down to technology. But in their view was, of course, mostly like a moral issue, and finalized to military and thus, political conquest, right? So that's all what they looked at, right? The Druidic training involved also, of course, fighting skills, gaming skills. There is something you can trace even in the Celtic world we made videos about the Giles, the Picts, showing like this kind of average education that the warrior class had, even in the Middle Ages with chess and some similar games existed before also in those contexts, were designed to be kind of probably a better ruler and warrior. But they weren't anything that, say, in fact, other peoples hadn't quite had, or that they just correspond to the degree of, in fact, of warlikeness and so of mysticism that was coupled with, especially in the case of the Gauls, with an important degree of development that the Romans were, as we've seen, fascinated and captivated by, because they saw in it somehow a bridge between modernity and tradition, based on which this entire powers were built successfully. So we have also just this knowledge, likely because also because of the importance that a figure like Divitiacus had due to the Gallic wars in his friendship with Cicero, with Caesar, as we will see now. So we have to put things in perspective. There were basically similar things also among other populations in Central Europe and beyond, right? It belongs to a universal language, really, that had been probably, I don't know, of the Scythians, of the Romans, of whoever, right? In any case, it's in fact the political and social dimension that should attract more interest, in my opinion, because what was also Caesar's um, deal in kind of describing the Druidic business, right? They controlled essentially the population and maintained a hold over them, and so it was important for the same Romans to understand this um, this doctrine, if you can call it like this, because that's mostly what the Romans equated it to, as a complex of, again, knowledge. Um, in fact, Caesar's description of the Druids presents them as essentially students of natural science, right? And it's misguided to pretend that this was disconnected with religion, or that we should add, okay, and this was religious too, like, because there is no such thing in these times, like a distinction between the two, right? So it's just our silly modernistic and technologistic mentality that must say, this is a bit religious, but this is, you see, also scientific, and yeah, but this is so literal, because we are obsessed with categorization from a couple of hundred years from now. Before, these concepts literally did not exist. You cannot read Caesar thinking that they thought like we do, right? It's really something else. And consider that the Romans wrote in a, let's say, the commentary are written especially with a bit more of a propaganda purpose, also for among the lower strata of the population, even to the elites, of course. But Caesar wrote beautifully. We know he could write in very advanced lyrical fashion, but of course when he was writing the commentary, he had a very specific political purpose for which he writes, for all Latin literature students know, like in a very simple, clear way, right? That looks as the substance, uses some words that are very also traditionally sounding, that of course refer a bit to that kind of Roman chivalric sagas mentality that was part of their epos, the exaltation of moral force, of heroes, of warriors, rather than what of course Caesar, as one of the most radically educated individuals of his times, just like Sulla and great parts of the Roman nobility at this time, was severely educated in also Hellenistic culture, etc., could afford to express, right? So also what is written about the Druids here fits that context that we must try to understand. And these are big topics I can't just even digress on today per se, but just I want to make you aware of the nuisance. Now, according to Caesar, the Druids are essential participants in all services to the gods. Right, so they're priests fundamentally. These services include also human sacrifices, which is yet another thing that people say, "Oh my God, the sacrifices!" It's because the Romans were telling that these were monstrous barbarians. Human sacrifices were normal. The Romans were fond with decapitation, gladiatorial games, the spoliopium, is it just and many other practices are the most evident relic of human sacrifices in their own culture, and human sacrifices were carried out by all peoples. So the Celts literally sacrificed humans, as I don't know, even the Franks and the same Gauls kept doing. Say in the Middle Ages, we know from the Celtic fringe that executing prisoners for religious purpose was just a defining identitary trait of these peoples. There is no conspiracy behind that, right? You're not somebody that people from 2,000 years ago deemed to be important enough to be misguided regarding to your personal paranoia and delusions. Learn history. I mean, the real one, not the bullshit you've learned in school and or even at university by some degree. I mean, hardcore educational expertise about these things, and not cheap books about people who want to say that, again, the Celts had spaceships and they can't even translate Latin on their own, right? Literally. And we are living in this world. These books exist also because I have them. Unfortunately, at least I read what they are, and they're extremely instructive regarding the level of cultural inferiority in which we have fallen. But it's properly the distance of the masses from a classical education, from literally the necessity of studying ancient sources, being able to translate them. In some countries, not even PhDs do this anymore. So we have arrived at a very dark place in the history of humanity, and it's not going to be better. So just be aware that there is a very specific structural years-long training that you must attain in order to at least having a valuable opinion about this topic, not even being an expert, of course. Nor I am, because you know that I am a medievalist, so I do something else, but you know, I spent my time studying this stuff as well. This philosophical emphasis, especially from the Roman sources in explanation of Druidic teaching, may have had to do with the way natural sciences, physiologia, that's how they called it, like, would essentially be framed, mostly in a Pythagorean way. For example, also what Cicero says about their capacity of predicting the future by augury is similar to what Posidonius comments about the Druids were, right? So continuing the Hellenic interpretation of the Druids as a species of natural scientists, right? And this naturally shouldn't be simply said, well, then it wasn't true, or no. Understand what they were telling you. They were telling you that these people had a pretty insightful understanding of nature, of everything concerned what could be the science of the time. Also, surely maths, we would know this because there are striking engineering capacities. There are ways that the Celts had to calculate distances across the continent, to found cities in very specific places. These are all stuff that today are very fashionable, also because we are rediscovering that, surprise, surprise, ancient traditions were dramatically advanced in, measurements, in, astronomical understanding, and generally speaking, the appreciation of natural phenomena in an empirical way, and there wouldn't be anything surprising about that. It's surely also possible that the Druids had somehow gathered this knowledge in ways that were different from the ones in the Roman world, that was much more Spartan in many ways, in spite of its the Hellenization of their literature and this kind of stuff. And this may have to do properly with the same reason why the Romans had emerged, for example, as an empire, as opposed to, for example, these tribes, because of reasons that I explained in that video about the moral superiority of the Roman civilization, that was essentially just resuming the concept of the action rather than contemplative life. So whatever these Druids knew, of course, wasn't anything that could save them from being taken over by the Romans, first of all, but secondly was probably just a broader summa, and surely in a very unique, original way that was pertaining to that specific culture, that, however, was probably also very similar in absolute terms to the ones used by other populations. The fact of also human sacrifices is more like a scale criticism rather than the substance of it, because there was literally no difference between what the Romans did and in terms of essentially sacrificing the enemy to the gods of victory. It's absolutely normal. The same gladiatorial games with slaves of war are the proof of this. The point is, what, of course, they would understand much better than us in terms of political practice, that is to say, how were, for example, Celtic human sacrifices performed, right? And with which political aim, fundamentally. Because the concept is that if you need to carry this out, it also tells that you can't do much else beyond that, right? The Romans were already walking in Alexander's footsteps as far as the concept that, the conqueror just present themselves and all the peoples bow to them, and there can be a peaceful cooperation. As we've seen, the Aedui were somehow also sensitive to this, and who knows what kind of ideas had permeated from Rome, from other places, given also the Celtic traveling merchants, and in fact, in curiosity and knowledge and intelligence from their side. So these are questions that unfortunately we will never be able to answer, because we literally lack the evidence for anything in that regard. But it's obvious that we can dimension these phenomena within, scales we can practically understand, right? Caesar had a great opinion of Divitiacus, right? It's also propagandistic in nature, because of course he had to embody the best of Gaul, that was open, staunchly loyal to Rome, and supporting the same imperium, right? Divitiacus did help Caesar enormously in his conquest of Gaul by persuading, for example, some of the tribes to collaborate with Rome. Caesar depended on him to form alliances that enabled him to conquer Gaul more smoothly and rapidly. He did remember him as literally the greatest man in Gaul, his words, a leader who had held sway among Gallic tribes and was also influential in Britain, which also points, of course, at the degree of prestige and charisma that the Druids had, as we've seen, major political players. And who knows what Caesar and Divitiacus spoke about, right? It's interesting also to think at the linguistic barrier that existed, in spite of the fact that Celt and Italic weren't that differentiated. They surely understood each other by an important degree, but some aspects are more like part of a cultural divide than else, right? The Romans had, as we have seen, an inflexibility that derived from the deepest conviction that they were just the superior people that God had chosen to take over the world. Well, aside from names like Dumnorix, let's say world ruler, etc., you don't have the same moral compaction within the Celtic world that you see in Rome. And this, as we have explained also in an Indo-European religious context, is actually very important, and it explains a lot of what Rome had fundamentally structured herself on, and also what the Celts had undergone over the centuries, because not all, as we've seen, were as civilized like the Aedui, and there were others that were much more hardcore, kind of traditional, and we have seen it in video, for example, about the Skordiski, that and not that the Aedui wouldn't be in their own way, but surely they had undergone an important change over time, and it was complicated to handle those realities from the within, because as we've seen, there hadn't been much of a pre-existing frame or a gluing capacity that just the Roman metus hostilis would essentially bring in the area. As we were saying before, in the early empire, still Bibracte, as the chief town of the Aedui, was a notable Druidic school. Right, it was replaced by Augustodunum in 12 BC, which may have been caused exactly by the need to divert the Aedui from this kind of Druidic fixation, in a sense. And when the Aedui and Treveri rebelled in 21 BC, as we've seen, they made it actually their chief object to take Augustodunum, so that they could get control of the noble Celtic young who were being educated there as well. So they were being Romanized and thus distracted from the older tradition. This would have provided them with hostages, by the way, to persuade the alliance of other tribes and families throughout Gaul. So it was always also a more practical issue. However, as we know, the Romans at a certain point prohibited and persecuted the Druids. Tiberius' acts of suppression followed especially the revolt of Sacrovir in 21 AD. And this brought, as Pliny tells us, to the suppression of the learned classes of Gaul. In other words, it was seen that the Druids were essentially detrimental to the process of Romanization, because they were cultivating essentially a political and military resistance to Rome through it. And this brought Druidism to be practiced in clandestinity. The Druids and others continued to practice in caves and glades, like the hedge schoolmasters of Ireland, for example. And some were exiled to Britain as well, right? So the way the Romans carried out this repression is quite interesting, because the Roman religion, contrarily to what you have been told, and any of these other religions, by the way, wasn't at all tolerant in the contemporary sense, right? The Romans had a feudal hierarchy of deities. In the traditional view of the world, you needed the inferior deities to be ruled over by the superior ones. And there was a complementarity in the process that justified ipso facto the necessity of the Uranian, Apollonian, virile, celestial, in fact imperial rule of the divine race was to essentially systematically subjugate the darker forces of the earth, the Chthonic, feminine, Demetrian, Pythagorean dimension, the Dionysian one. I mean, the Romans had prohibited the Bacchanalian, and we will see as properly as a foundation of the Roman deep conviction that Rome had essentially shifted the axis from the feminine ruled, especially Pelasgian, Mediterranean, but don't think that this didn't apply to peoples like the Celts or even the Germans, because at the fringe of the Indo-European world, the actual relevance of the dark forces of Earth, the feminine ones, is actually stronger than in the Hellenic or the Roman religion. I mean, Gallic mythology is quite eloquent of that. Think about the Morrigan, think about just the various symbology, right? The darker forces in general, the gloominess, the crowds. There are also eagles, there are also Apollonian celestial symbols, but this felt like a world, of course, that is sinking towards the abyss, as all the traditions actually claim. And Rome is credited with having representated, according to the prophecies, this last space of golden age that corresponds to the Augustan one, essentially between the Bronze and the Iron one, the Iron being naturally the last age before the end of the world. So, of course, also the Celts had this ideology. In fact, the aforementioned last stand of Sacrovir and his retinue at Augusta Dunum is exactly that kind of storming of the Asgard, waiting for the age of the wolf and the fighting of the gods right against the forces of evil and all these things. So, of course, they all, by competing, thought of each other the thing. But there is also an absolute capacity that we have to measure how much certain cultures were influenced by the two ideas. And the idea is that only the full light, virile, celestial one wins on Earth, as especially from a military point of view, to have an order, the same one Rome had established. That is, again, ipso facto the proof of it, right? This is what all these other peoples believed, in a way. But they always naturally felt the need to prove that they were more than the other, as they did constantly against each other, mostly at a tribal level. Naturally, when Rome arrives, this is seen as a challenge that you take either, as we've seen just with Divitiacus or Dumnorix, either you are part of it, and hence the process of Romanization, and even this extraordinary thing that the Romans have brought for the first time as an evangelion, that is to say, you can participate the race of divine ruler to the citizenship in the imperium, or you fight because you think you're better, but if you lose, you aren't, right? So the Roman persecution of the Druids is to be seen like a kind of counter-terrorist policy in this regard. And looking at the characters of these religions, we will see that there is something a bit different from what pop culture has wanted to make us think as, even with the following modern racistic ideology that is essentially a zoological materialism that is incompatible also with the racial ideology of the ancient world, that is extremely discriminatory, but it's based on the transfigurational base that has nothing to do with the immutability of race, because that's literally denying the transcendence of mankind. So reflected these things, because there are actually remarkably darker forces in these kind of northern peoples as compared to, in this case, Rome. And there is also just the self-evident scale of power Rome had achieved in a unitary sense, in an orderly sense, so in the perfectly Apollonian one. There would be a lot to say, but to make the long story short, in 54 AD, Claudius abolished the whole Druidic order, notoriously, as Suetonius tells us. This was justified and legitimized on the basis of the fact that this was called as a religion of cruelty. So what the Romans saw as a useless, vicious resistance, and also, attached with these kind of ritual, massacres and things that, again, were practiced habitually. But we know this ethnoanthropologically. It's not based just on what the Romans say. It's a very well-known reality that had hardly to do with, at that point, the establishment of a new order, but essentially the destruction of the one accomplished. That's the same reason why the Romans, for example, executed slaves in the arena, or criminals, because they were the power that could allow that to happen in a regularized way, right? And you can argue that in the essence there is no difference, but exactly that essence does not exist, because what both the Celts and the Romans believed is that happens only if it can happen. So if you can prevent it from happening, including persecuting this movement, you are successful. And in fact, Druidism disappeared. And so kind of Rome accomplished the mission, right? Consider that already Augustus, that had a giant statue of Apollo on the Palatine, had merely forbidden Druids to become Roman citizens, but still, right? So saying there is something wrong with that, right? There are some core values that are unacceptable for the type of universal imperial divine order that we are sanctioning with the Aurea Secula. In 71 AD, in the revolt of the Batavian Civilis, we find Druids in this kind of Gallo-Roman Germanic context, prophesizing the destruction of Roman power. Right, that's what we're left with. Again, every mythology states that, again, the citadel of time of the gods of the natural order will be stormed. Right, it's the same concept of, again, the snake at the roots of the Irminsul that erodes them gradually. Right, the doom is approaching in a way or another. Right, and the only way to prevent this is fighting in a way that you can't even properly achieve if you do not become a god yourself. That's also the concept of the transfiguration in the Valhalla, in the in all the heaven. That, again, also the Roman apotheosis embodies. So thinking it from this perspective, right? It's obvious that you're going to repress somebody that is not succeeding in unhinging the order, because the only way to unhinge the order, this order to be crippled to the point it doesn't work anymore. Right, at that point there was rather instead the full sway of Romanization, so hardly a concept of that kind. The Druids prophesied the fall of Rome as portended by a fire which broke out in the capital, all these things, and this means that there were still Druids around, but that essentially the last movements, political and military, had ended up at least in Gaul half a century before. And that's why that kind of teaching also declined, and itself, right, it came less to its same foundations afterwards, preconceptions, because again, it was valid for everyone in the same way. And the Romans left us with this concept, of course, of Druidism in a negative sense, which must be understood better too, because we don't know exactly what its content was per se. But we can't. Today's video can't resume this, but we can absolutely talk about it in another. Tacitus uses, for example, the word fanatic to describe the Celtic wild irrationality. It's part of that virtus that is expressed traditionally but not controlled enough to be successful. Right? The same reason why the Celts were basically eventually conquered by the Romans is the concept of a wild irrationality that does not fit with the Roman Clausewitzian concept of a discipline having to being au pair, I would say, with the virtus, that is technically that same furor that the Romans had begun to attribute also to these other peoples, because they knew what it practically meant, but they said we were able to master ourselves, because in all the Indo-European religions the idea is that if you do not attain the wildest elements of your person, you can and master them without any emotion, so with full rationale, with full Apollonian ideal, you cannot return to the divine. You cannot win. You cannot have the imperium in synchrony with God. Thus, it's obvious that these practices reflected that level of civilizational backwardness in a way. Right? There are reasons why the Celts fought, for example, the way they did, or had the same political and social system. And yes, it wasn't more successful than the Roman one. It also had stemmed from essentially an identical background. Now, Tacitus considered he's also a senator, so if you read even just the way he writes in Latin, you immediately understand what kind of mindset he has just in the worldview. It's still very unsecular and unmodern after all. So he, exactly for this reason, he strikes exactly to the core of those ideologies when he's expressing his judgments. He's very haughty and very much that sense of ultra elite of himself that is sometimes even aggressively so, but objectively he's pointing out what was common knowledge at the time in assessing that kind of Roman superiority on the base of traditional knowledge. Right? Again, we could easily read Tacitus and make you some example of just how literally he believes in the imperium. Right? There is no way around that. Read the passages, for example, in the Jewish War. There are lots of very beautiful, properly political takes on how and why people do what they do when they don't fundamentally understand what they're doing. Tacitus applies the same fanatism even to properly an Aeduan religious and subversive leader in 69 AD who claimed to be divine, right? And the question is, how can you be divine if you are not accomplishing much? You can claim to be divine even just by being history is full of all divine titles attributed even to lesser, like even to brigands, right? To somebody who said, I am that much, but then evidently it's just what you can boast, and so it's even a lie, so it's even impossible for you at that point to receive the imperium, and the proof of that is that you're a marauder, not an emperor, right? This is crucial. There is, relatively to this last aspect of personal divinity among the Aedui, an interesting element of divine couples that are represented in Aeduan art. We'll see in a while that could give us another hint about essentially the Dionysian character of these claims. Tacitus is also concerned to the point of the contrast between the wild superstition of the Celts, in fact, and the dignified religious ceremonies of the Romans. In other words, he said that the superstitiones were above these peoples because they thought there was something above them that they couldn't achieve with their own personal action, and thus they had to devote themselves de facto, increasing the hiatus between the accomplishment and themselves, while the the Roman ceremonies were basically mirroring that establishment that had been capable of asserting that power. What we see among the Aedui is definitely the cult of the dead culminated at the family earth, right? Around which the dead were even buried, especially among the Aedui. This is interesting because it speaks a little bit more of in fact, of the chronization of their culture. The custom might have been general among the Gauls, right? You know that there is also a change over time. From the Indo-Europeans cremated the bodies, right? Because they literally thought they were to transfigure. But this was also the prerogative of the elites. So if even the elites inhumate, means that as there is in the Gallic world, in the westernmost part of Europe, from the opposite side of where the Indo-Europeans were coming, and also probably importantly populated by others that from the Bronze Age of the civilization of the mothers, essentially this communistic cult based on the earth and all the economic dimension before the earth, before the Indo-Europeans. You can think that there was an important impact among the entire system, the entire ideology. And that's why probably the Romans also disliked this. In fact, the belief of the presence of ancestral ghosts around the earth was widespread, right? There are many superstitions that are called among these people. So the Romans saw that, like, this is irrational. What are you scared by these things? What kind of divine power do you have if you fear lesser deities? It's not that the Romans didn't believe that those deities existed, but to them, as more powerful as they were and the least relevant they were, numerous Celtic rivers had their own genius, very often a female one, and this is true also for the Romans. For Italy, it's normal because at least those are, in fact, the waters, the tectonic places par excellence. But again, you know that in the Celtic world there is a dramatic amount of that. Just think about the Dame of the Lake in the Arthurian legions, all these kind of things. We're even military power that should be male par excellence in the hardcore Indo-European tradition, there is somehow even countered by a female dimension. Again, think about Morrigan. But there are many examples here and there. We find Epona, the great mare, sometimes appearing with a foal, considered the Welsh ebol, that is foal plus the suffix on for the theonym, so it's very... There is a similarity among the Celts altogether. Particularly in the territory of the Aedui, you find this goddess, which is effectively the only Celtic one that came to be worshipped in Rome herself. Rome gathered all these forces, and the idea is that by uniting them, it would elevate the Saint Romans to the unitary top that the absolute one of God and of the empire embodied. As literally, we took them because we control these people and we control even these gods. The Romans threatened gods from destruction from the face of the earth if they hadn't supported them instead of their own people. And they did that. And it's beautiful if you think about it. And so hardly anything tolerant like the BS that they told you. And the interesting thing is not even the other peoples behaved like that at all, right? There is an order, there is a truth, and you cannot mess up with that. We find many indigenous couples being represented, right? There's always a god and a goddess, interestingly enough. Per se, it implies divine marriage and therefore consequent fertility. And among the Aedui, an anonymous couple is the dominant iconographical type. Naturally, it speaks also of a nobiliar power. It talks about, we've seen the aforementioned alliance of Dubnorix with the Helvetii and the Sequani was secured through marriage ties, etc. So the idea of the nobility marrying, dynasticizing power is something enormously important, as we've seen, to gather, in fact, force over the masses and elevating themselves as a hardcore elite, which again, in the Gallic world is very stratified, even before Roman times, and even the origins of chivalry you can date to that kind of feudal system that formed itself in Gaul because of this enormous and extended and also controllable agricultural plains, are very populated. You can establish lordships and so on. Consequently, however, the masses bring this kind of agricultural kind of chthonic dimension above. In fact, the goddess usually represented has a cornucopia and a patera as badges of her prosperity role, and sometimes also the god called the male one carries a cornucopia, which is pretty weird because, again, that's kind of a symbol of the earth, and that shouldn't touch what should be a celestial deity of great power and military one. It's a dirty agricultural business. It's not what the absolute nobility should do, which is not a way to say that these weren't powerful men, but as we've seen, they lose in 8 years the entire control of Gaul after having been, essentially attacked by the Germans, who ran around the country unstopped. So it's the dimming of the awareness of the sacred and of the ancestry, actually, at that point. We also have epigraphy showing us a number of couples, and there are interesting ones such as Luxovius and Bricta in Luxeuil, Bormo and Damona, Ucuetis and Bergusia, Sucellus and Nantosuelta. The last couple is particularly fascinating because the god, who often appears on his own, is characterized by a long shafted hammer. Like Thor. Remember the Germanic origin? It could be that it was intended in that fashion originally. It's called the good striker. However, in southern Gaul, this is even more chthonic, this central Gallic that were again more somehow Indo-Europeanly influenced, is associated with the emblems of woodland and fertility and the god Silvanus, right? So a sort of peasant protector of harvest and cattle, and even in up to the Moselle area, seems to have had a dominion over the local wine trade, and by implication, the fertility of the wine. This is a typically Dionysian figure. Right, so there is of course a Dionysian trance that is used to induct the states of the hero that has to fight eventually against to tame these forces, but alone, without much of another celestial dimension. It speaks actually of a merely chthonic one. There is the goddess Nantosuelta that we've just mentioned, has varying attribute, but for example in the land of the Mediomatrici of Alsace, she often bears the image of a house on a long pole, so emphasizing essentially a domestic function. And this couple has other attributes such as pots, barrels. They may all reflect the wine protection alluded to just now. Now, Burgundy, as we know, is the land of wine. In the Middle Ages, at some point, travelers said in the 13th century that people there lived just by exporting wine, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but not that distant from the truth. And that's okay. But wine is toxic, and it's anti-Apollonian by definition. Right, so the Celts made extensive use of drugs too, as you know, and this too was considered like you're not strong enough fundamentally to endure pain and strength and all these things without it. And that's why for the Romans this was unconceivable. If the Druidic cults were connected as to the elite to this kind of representation, well, we wouldn't be that surprised the Romans were against them so much ideologically. The goddess name Winding River, for example, also demonstrates the presence of the Great Mother there, repeatedly associated with the ravens, right? So necrophagous animals. There are in Britain as well, and these are, again, there is a dual symbolism within them, but it's hardly an Apollonian one. Thus, if we want to assess essentially what the Aeduan deal with also the Druidic connection was, is something you have to be scared and aware of, because these are the forces of evil that you have to tame. But they seem to be lacking something more celestial. The Aeduan chief Dumnorix who fought Caesar, as we've seen, is probably depicted on an inscribed coin showing a warrior with Carnix boar standard and severed head, presumably a battle trophy. Severed head, in this sense, surely goes in parallel with the human sacrifice. The boar standard is the symbol, of course, of also priesthood in the Celtic world, not the real warrior there, and it's a chthonic element that goes against the bear, that instead is the one properly of the divine, as also a chthonic dimension by a degree, but still the one who devours and destroys the chthonic animal par excellence as the boar in this context, and gains more power divinely. The boar is also where skin is how the Thor's hammer is forged into in the process. The Carnix is naturally another, if you want, it's a less Apollonian thing, because we know it was very modulated, could make very elaborate sounds, and it still mostly has the form of a chthonic animal. The Romans had somehow surpassed this, as you know. They were much more, simple, geometric, in that kind of even of specificity, rigidity. So this customization and all these kind of Dionysian symbols seem to point at the fact that the Romans were pretty disturbed by the what this evidently non-Apollonian substratum was, as far as their imperial projects were concerned. Naturally, we can see this also for other peoples. For example, at the end of the Latin period, religious convergences occurred between the Aedui and the neighboring Lingones and Sequani, as it's archaeologically evidenced by the similarity in the practices at the sanctuaries. Conversely, we have the Romans building a temple of Janus just outside the Aeduan town of Augustodunum, which dates probably back to the second half of the 1st century AD, which may have been a symbol of closure with the previous conflict, saying, look, this is the new age that has begun, the golden one. Janus is the god, from which also January takes the name from, because it looks back at the past year, the first month, and then looks at the future, and its gates were open in times of war. So it wasn't important and closed in time of peace, conversely. So it was an idea of, look, you have a choice here, to go on, to go back, what you do, right? And the reason, as we've seen, that the town was set to fire by the same rebelling Aedui at some point, but they were crushed anyway. So bear in mind the symbolism there, because it was a warning, but also a proposal of cooperation, and on the basis of an importantly long relation with Rome. We can conclude in a much different time, the 3rd, 4th century, when the when Eumenius, the orator from Augustodunum, pledged for the restoration of the schools in his town, right? As much as Ausonius, the Roman poet and teacher of the 4th century, from Burdigal in Aquitaine, whose mother's family seems to have possessed considerable lands and to have been part of the nobility of the Aedui, right? His father was a self-made success in his profession as doctor, by the way, so who knows whether some Druidic knowledge was passed down from that Gallo-Roman background in such late age, in which even Christianity was coming by then. You see, it's not so much such a long time ago, right? And these things must be appreciated, their importance, in their legacy, in their origins, must be contextualized, must be carefully thought of and assessed with an historical judgment. So I think that today's video speaks interestingly of the Aedui, and we can make other videos about other Gallic tribes. We'll surely come back on the Aedui at some point in other ways. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.